Today's episode is sponsored by Ground News. We are underway. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show, Substack.com, and at YouTube. I'm with my bi-weekly conversation partner, John McWhorter, who teaches at Columbia. And we're joined this week by Matt Taibbi, the distinguished journalist and troublemaker. Hey there, Matt. How you doing?
How's it going?
I mean, Goldman Sachs is like a vampire squid on the face of humanity whose blood sucking anywhere it smells money. I mean, didn't you write that sentence, Matt?
From what I heard, the Goldman guys found that funny. In fact, I heard the press. One of the press people actually got a brass squid for his desk. So,
oh yeah, of course, he's proud of it.
Yeah,
oh no,
exactly.
Wait. Here's a better one. Max Boot is a gelatinous mediocrity.
Yeah, I thought that fit, but
yeah, no argument here. No argument here. Anyway, Matt is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone. He is a publisher. No longer.
No, I haven't been with them for a year. Mm-hmm.
Beg your pardon. Well, you are the publisher of TK News, which is a very successful Substack, and author of Hate Inc. That's your most recent book. As I say, troublemaker, because we are in a period of crisis here in American intellectual life, journalism, politics and so forth, and you're right on top of it. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Likewise.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate hearing that. And you are also a veteran of having spent some time in Russia and in Central Asia, Mongolia, Uzbekistan.
Yes.
I read that you played professional basketball in Mongolia and Uzbekistan. I mean, now how many people can say that?
Yeah. There was a period in 1996. I was living in Moscow at the time, working for the Moscow Times, and I play street basketball at Moscow State University, which you've probably seen pictures of. It has that great big wedding cake building, skyscraper. Really cool place to play basketball. And I met a Mongolian student who told me that they had a new league in his country called the NBA, the Mongolian Basketball Association. They used NBA rules, had a 24-second shot clock. So I went in the next day and I quit and my job at the paper and jumped in the Siberian Railroad and moved to Mongolia for a while so I played a season in the NBA.
In the
it was known as the Mongolian Rodman. Yes.
Are they any good?
Matt, what did they speak on the team?
Yeah.
What language were they using?
So that's an interesting question. So the younger generation in Mongolia spoke purely Mongolian. If you were, let's say, older than 20 in 1992, 91, you were probably a better Russian speaker, at least the Ulaanbaatar.
Exactly.
So I didn't speak Mongolian. I only spoke Russian. So it was a little with some of my teammates.
They didn't speak Russian anymore. Right. That's what I was thinking.
A few of them did.
Right.
And my coach was a fluent speaker.
Right.
But it was odd, it was an interesting experience.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way to know Mongolian. It's just that's local. And so, yeah, that's hard.
What's interesting is that Mongolians, it's related to three other languages in the world. One is Magyar, or Hungarian, Estonian, and Finnish. So that's I always thought that was very odd. It's a very hard language to learn.
Matt, actually, most linguists don't think that anymore. What you're talking about is when I was a kid. I know this is getting far from what the show's supposed to be.
It's all right. It's all right.
Finnish and Hungarian are called Uralic, and there is no longer thought to be a significant relationship between Uralic and Altaic Altaic, which is what Mongolian is in.
Really?
Yeah, I learned Ural Altaic too, but nowadays that's considered wrong. But I know what you mean. Yeah, and Mongolian is quite different. Yes.
Well, wait a minute,
yeah,
John.
it's hard. It's harder than the case system is difficult and all that. So.
You learned, John. You learned Ural Altaic.
I learned that there was a Ural Altaic family. You'd see on the inside cover of big dictionaries and encyclopedias, and that was supposed to be this family. But then it was decided that Uralic is by itself, and Altaic is another family, which is Turkish, Mongolian, Manchu, and a lot of people don't even think Altaic is a family. But I frankly think it is. But it's not. Those languages aren't related to Estonian, Finnish, and Hungarian. But whatever.
Wow. So okay, cool. Yeah. Well, learn something every day.
Moving on.
Yeah.
Matt, you've been reporting and commenting about what's going on in the war of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on. What's going on from your perspective?
I don't know. I got this completely wrong. I had to do something that I done in a long time, which is sort of publicly apologize for a wrong call. I did not see this invasion coming. I'm still in touch with a lot of people back in Moscow, including a lot of people in the press, and didn't see this coming either. And so it's very difficult to know what that decision of Putin's was all about. A lot of us who were early critics of in 99, 98, 2000, when he was first coming to power, the assumption about Putin was always that he was completely amoral, but rational and pragmatic, and that what he was doing had a purpose behind it. And this is the first time where I just couldn't see the angle from his perspective, even unless it's some kind of emotionally driven decision that has to do with the civil war in the Donbass area that I don't understand, not having been there since then. Well, I mean, what do you think? I mean, I think it's from the outside, it's very difficult to see gains by attacking Western Ukraine. And for all the heat that John Mearsheimer has taken recently, I kind of agree with the assessment that Putin doesn't have designs on conquering and keeping the whole country. So it's just hard to see what he's up to. Bombing Lviv and places like that.
You don't want to call someone insane, as in mental balanced. It's not an economical analysis. Very few people are crazy, but in this case, you really do wonder whether he has become a little bit unhinged or mentally enfeebled. And I don't think the explanation that he's got a bunch of yes men quite explains it, because the issue is what those people were saying to him and how sensible it would have seemed, even if that's all he heard. And just the rationale behind this seems so shaky and so thoughtless that I just wonder. I wouldn't be surprised if this were kind of like, what we learned about Ronald in a certain, gradual decline. It makes no blessed sense whatsoever. Like, let's say that he blasts the country down to the ground. Then he has to handle the country. Why would he want a flattened Ukraine that he would have to get back up into functioning? Any human being understands that that's what he's doing. I don't get it. It's like he thinks he's in a play or something, but this isn't a play.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Glenn, you had a question?
Well, yeah, I was going to say Putin is just one man, and to discuss this issue as though he were an absolute dictator whose personality and psychology was driving events makes me a little uncomfortable. I'd like to know something more about the structure of power internal to Russia and and all of that. It's not just him, is it?
Well, he has a close military advisor, and there's been a figure named Sergei Shoigu who's kind of been with him all those years and has been there dating back to the Yellows. But there were a number of Russian reporters who commented on a National Security Council meeting that was held just a few days before the invasion. And they were all struck by the sort of look of surprise on all their faces. There was one, I think it was a BBC based, but she's ethnically Russian reporter, who described the members there as being like kids who had just been handed a surprise test in class. And so there, any people who have sources within the Russian government, there are many, even among the sort of Russian diaspora reporters. But what they were getting is that it doesn't seem like anybody had any clue this was coming. If you watch the POW videos, and obviously you can't trust everything that you're seeing that's coming from the Ukraine side, but it really does seem like the people who were sent initially, the frontline Russian troops, were actually not trained for this mission. That they were told coming in for a 3 to 5 day exercise that they'd be home at the end of that. So there are a lot of indications that not many people knew that this was coming.
The one thing that might make some sense of this is that perhaps Putin and or people who convinced him to do this or helped convince him to do this aren't fully aware of the nature of modern communications and social media, because it can be easy to miss that sort of thing, even if you understand it intellectually. This would have made a certain sense 25 years ago when there was an awful lot they could have done behind the scenes. But with everybody having a phone where you can just see everything that they're doing, whatever they say, can't help thinking, how did they think they were going to get away with that kind of thing now? But then again, I don't know. In 2003, I was so behind in terms of understanding how important blogs were. I let an article go out under my name that had been edited into complete shit, thinking, I'd rather not rock the boat. I'll never write for this publication again. But, frankly, a few people will read this and it'll go into the trash can. Know that now I was writing for online and that the article would chase me for the next 20 years. And I'm not that stupid. It's just that it takes me a few years to catch on to what everybody else is doing. Maybe that, the way I'm referring to how hip hop holds blacks back, for the record.
I remember that one, John.
That article is like 5% what I wrote or thought. But maybe what's going on with Putin and his people, they don't quite understand what it means that everybody has a phone in their pocket now, and that we can communicate so quickly and that it's hard to lie. That's the only thing that makes any sense to me about this.
It's possible. I mean, and he came of age in the KGB at a time when secrets were much easier to keep. Mm-hmm. They had a premium on him. He talks constantly. If you ever listen to Putin speak, he's always giving these pains to the professionals in the services, and how great they are at keeping things, their cards close to the vest. Yeah, it's possible that maybe he thought that he could pull a surprise attack and not have it be known, by every tweeter in America 5 days ahead of time. I mean, he's not from this generation,
right?
It is possible. He also, and I think this is a part maybe I didn't think about enough. He has a sadistic streak that comes out fairly regularly and has been coming out more and more in the way he speaks. Famously, back in the day when he was talking about the Chechens, he held this sort of impromptu press conference where he said, if they're in the outhouse, we'll whack them in the outhouse. Like, that's it. And he made a point of talking about using like gang language when he talked about how he was going to go to war with people. So I think there might be something where he's got an emotion, urge to shed some blood in Ukraine, and that might be behind this. That's come out of his personality many times, and we've seen it with his behavior towards journalists too. So, that would be another explanation.
I gather he gave a speech recently in which he denounced those Russians who are not behind the war effort, referring to them as insects or something to that effect.
Muhi, yeah, flies, yeah.
Mhm.
So now, does he have absolute power? I mean, can he do anything that he wants? Are we really talking about a dictator here who can, pretty much have his enemies executed on demand, or is there not a coterie of others who are supporting him? And also, what about the man and woman on the street in Moscow or Petersburg? Are they more or less pro-Putin and pro-Russia?
Well, functionally speaking, the president has had near absolute power going back to the early 90s, frankly. I mean, there have always been competing factions of influence within Russian society. There was a period in the mid 90s where it was more of an oligarchy than a dictator, where you had competing gangland clans. It was like The Godfather. Instead of 5 families, there were 7 families in Russia. Each one had its own sort of media empire. They had their own mineral and oil interests. But one of Putin's innovations when he came to power was consolidating all those groups and forcing them to pledge loyalty to him, and expulsion of people like Misha Khodorkovsky, who you've probably seen written and talked about here in the States. He's the former president of Yukos. He did some prison time in Russia. And there was another guy named Vladimir Gusinsky who was dealt with way back when. So there aren't competing sort of political interests in the same way that there were once upon a time there. I think if he doesn't have absolute power, it's close to it at this point.
So you got it wrong. I'm sorry, John.
I was just saying it's scary because I don't see why he won't try to do this with some other countries. And I know that's original thought, but if this quote unquote works in Ukraine, my sense is he's not as angry at Belarus, but what about the Baltic nations? Why not? I get the feeling that there's
NATO
a particular issue. But Ukraine is a particular issue. I mean, because of the history and the geography. But what would be next?
Well, I mean, I got this wrong before, so I feel a little bit odd making any kind of prognostication about the future. But I'm not even certain that he really wants Ukraine. Certainly, he wants the Crimea. Certainly, he wants Luhansk and Donetsk and Mariupol. Like, he probably wants whole
that
eastern area, which. I've been to the regions there, once upon a time, they were very, I would say, ethnically, culturally Russian, right? Whereas the city right now, Lvov, on the other side of the country, I mean, I needed a translator to work there. It's more like Poland than it is Russia. So, yeah, I don't know. I can't see him going into the Baltics, but I didn't see this happening either. So, who knows? But the Russians, they have the greatest record in terms of military success in the last few decades. Terrible trouble with Chechnya, which is a much smaller region. They ended up having to level the city of Grozny. They took incredible losses when they thought they would be able to take it over in a couple of hours. So it's taken a pretty big toll on their society just to handle some pretty small regions. Abkhazia, the Crimea wasn't so much of a problem, but certainly Chechnya, that whole and now this whole fiasco. It's not a good look for their military.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this whole Western issue. because it would almost make a sense if he tried to basically cut the country in half and take the quote unquote Russified side. That would be a hideous thing, but still would make a certain sense. But I've been surprised to see him going off into the Western part, the more Ukrainian part of Ukraine, as if he just has to show it has to be the whole country rather than the parts where any remote sense at all to suppose that they could be part of Russia, although it didn't. So yeah, there's an issue of the gesture here, and it seems to be irrespective of what the army is actually capable of doing or once again, it's like he's writing a book rather than dealing with the real world. And that's the cruelty of this. He's sending people to their deaths on the basis of this grandeur of reuniting the real Russia. This is something people do in plays. It's just so unintuitive to me that this is actually happening.
Well, he's got a tremendous feeling of sentimentality about the Soviet Union, not about the ideology, but about the imperial strength of it. He talks about it constantly. He talked about it back then when I was still there. I mean, it was his idea to restore the old Soviet national anthem. He's talked about how no person with a heart doesn't miss the Soviet Union. No person with a brain thinks it could come back. I forget what the actual translation is there, but he does have a little bit of a mystical side, and maybe that's what this is all about. But again, that's not his history. His history has been that he's super ruthless, pragmatic, and this seems to me like it's a little bit out of character for him to make this move. Now, if he had occupied the Eastern Territories and kind of dared the West to do something with it, that would have been perfectly in character. Like that's what most of us.
Crimea.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But this is different.
It's hard for people like us to get this because you don't feel that way as an American. Our sense of what America is less tribal than that. In trying to put myself in his head, I'm trying to imagine how he feels about the nature of Russia, the nature of the Soviet Union, the sentiment attached to that. The American experiment is such, God, that sounds pretentious. The American experiment is such.
We'll forgive you, John. Go ahead, wave the flag just a little bit.
Yeah. The American experiment is such, that we don't have that native sense. We can pretend, USA and, some stuffed thing with a big finger and hot dogs and stuff like that, but we don't feel that way. We're all too different. I'm trying to imagine how people feel about being Black, how people feel about being Estonian, how people feel about being Latino, maybe how some people are forcing themselves to feel about being white with a capital W. That's the closest that we can get to this, but I can kind of understand how
Let me try this on you, John.
Tribal feeling.
So we're worried, some of us, about the rise of China. America's a great power, is the great power. It's the global hegemon, but the Chinese are coming. There are 2 billion of them. They're really smart. Their economy is growing fast, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine fast forward 20 years or 30 years. We're challenged in Taiwan and we back down. The Chinese influence throughout East Asia grows and grows. The Japanese, the Koreans have to find their peace with China. And we're feeling ourselves displaced as a world power. Is that anything like what a nationalistic Russian might feel at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the displacement of the Soviet Union, a world power, by Russia, a failing state with a declining population and eviscerated economy and a humiliated Afghanistan experience and so forth and so on? Can we put ourselves in the shoes of a nationalistic Russian today by imagining what it might feel like to see ourselves being eased off the center stage of world affairs by the Chinese 30 or 40 years from now?
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. I mean, we want to think of it in terms of like what was the American sentiment during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's kind of more how I think the Russian may view this situation. Like whatever you think about the Monroe Doctrine or this idea that we have to have primacy over a sphere of influence, and I know that that's practically a taboo subject in the media now, but that's how a lot of Russians think about this situation. They don't like the idea of NATO creeping closer to their borders. The story about Edward Shevardnadze and James Baker negotiating of communism, and Baker promising that we wouldn't take one step towards the Soviet border. Like, that's a story that every Russian, and I'm not even talking ethnically Russian, everybody who lived in areas knows. And it's a story that nobody here knows. And they're very sensitive about this stuff. And people who are very Western leaning, like the people I went to school with in the 90s, kids who spoke English, who ended up living in the West. I mean, I remember one friend of mine looking at an old map of the Soviet Union and saying, "Oh my God, what a big, beautiful country that was," and that still exists among people who were sort of virulently anti-communist. And so there's a lot of conflicted feelings among Russians about this whole thing. And the idea of NATO being this close in Ukraine, it's going to rub, especially the sort of nationalist types in the country the wrong way, and so that's not to say that this is in any way justified. I'm just saying that that's the sentiment in the country.
If you're someone like me who's constantly bombarded with news from a digital landscape you just can't seem to trust, Ground News is for you. For every breaking news story, they'll show you which media outlets are reporting on the issue and where they fall on the political spectrum, so you can instantly spot media bias, discover stories outside of your echo chamber, and get some clarity in this increasingly chaotic world. The Ground News website and app lets you compare headlines from left, center, and right sources with a simple swipe. And their blind spot feed will show you stories that are not being reported by one side of the political spectrum. Subscribers can also gain access to features like My News Bias, which lets you track your reading habits so you can see how factual your sources are, who owns them, and much more. Ground isn't better news, it's a better way to consume it. Get all of your news in one place. Download the Ground News app or install the browser extension to make sure you're seeing the full picture. Visit ground.news/The Glenn Show. That's ground.news/The Glenn Show.
In some ways, I always envy it, not here, but that sense that you belong to a tribe of people, historical sentiments and grievances. And I know people are thinking, why doesn't he feel that way about being Black? And yes, I admit that an awful lot of what unites many Black Americans in the sense of the grievance against whites, et cetera, is something I prefer not to think about as much as a lot of them do, because it's not the basis of an identity. I prefer to have a positive one. No, that doesn't mean that I don't think myself as Black, but that tribal sentiment, I've never had it the way I feel like I'm supposed. And it can lead you to do wonderful things. It can lead you to do some really stupid shit. And I guess that's what we're seeing here. Wow.
Well, my question,
maybe,
John, No, I was just going to ask John, why don't you feel that way about being an American? I mean, Black is pretty thin.
I did after 9/11 and was told by, my Blue America friends that was wrong and that I had, lost my way in some way. But I felt very American after 9/11. I was very angry for a good few years based on that. Lost some friends, actually. So yeah, I did then. That I gotta sit. But America's complicated, and we're all complicated. It's interesting.
Yeah, and also in the internet age, you have to remember this whole affair that's been going on in the Donbass for years now. So what's been happening in both of those countries, the Ukrainians are looking at all the videos of the atrocities Russians commit, and Russians are looking at all the videos of the atrocities Ukrainians commit. And it's awful stuff. It's out there. If you want to look for it, you can find it. You're inclined to get whipped up into a nationalist fervor. There's plenty of things to look at on the internet that will get Russians there quickly. A lot of the stuff that involves like the Azov battalion, even friends of mine who are extremely liberal, who are, deep critics of Putin, muckraking journalists who took him on back in the day. They were pushing back with me a little bit when I emailed them about this stuff in the last couple of weeks, and saying, these Ukrainians did this and that. So yeah, it's a complicated situation for sure.
Yeah. My girlfriend is Russian, and she was showing me the kind of media that the typical Russian is exposed to. And it was fascinating just to see the creative sense of what the truth is. And yet you can certainly understand how the ordinary Russian is processing these things. I completely get that. It's the people higher up, who have, so to speak, a broader view of this where one gets confused. But yeah, from what the ordinary person sees when they go online, I get how it would look like all of this made sense. Yeah, that's the nature of modern media too, that you can do that better than you did before.
Okay,
you
guys.
Build your own experience. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to ask, am I the only one looking back at Russiagate, which you, Matt, have called the WMD of our generation, at how stupid and disconnected from reality that whole moral panic looks now that we're confronted with the geopolitical implications of Russian power being projected into Ukraine? I mean, did we have our heads up our butt about Russia for a bit of time, or what? I mean, one of your recent posts, Matt, is Orwell was right. And I read between the lines there a little bit that you were saying, we got our own thought policing, and we've got our own double speak going on, new speak going on right here. And I think Russia is a big part of that. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big point I was trying to make there was that this new style of media that we have now, and you're both academics. I've been in the media business for 30 years, and our way of doing things has shifted radically in the last 6 or 7 years, where the goal is to get the audience whipped into a fervor about something and keep them there, as opposed to the old Walter Cronkite method where, you sort of calmly read the news and then tell people they can come back tomorrow. Now you want them freaked out, panicked, and then at the end of the show, Rachel hands off to Lawrence O'Donnell, and then Lawrence O'Donnell hands off to, like, the idea is to keep them constantly scrolling. And we've gone through panic after panic after panic in the last 6 or 7 years. Everything from Russiagate to Kavanaugh to Bountygate to, the pandemic of the unvaccinated to the insurrection. Some of them are more real than others, but I think the cumulative impact of that is that we're creating a kind of media consumer that doesn't remember things very well because they're always so in the moment. And this was what Orwell was writing about in 1984, the primacy of the present, like where whatever's true right now was always true, and it doesn't matter what happened back in the day. And I think we've been very successful at building that kind of consumer that is capable of forgetting about all kinds of things really quickly. And in this case, it could be our history in Iraq. Like, you see people saying things like, well, how could you invade a sovereign nation? Or that's never happened in 80 years. like really? I mean, so that's all I was trying to write about in that piece.
Matt, would you say, and I know this could go many ways, would you say that America learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, which are now essentially 20 years ago? Because my feeling has been, yes, we're sitting here saying, how can you possibly invade another country? And it was 10 minutes ago that we did the same thing for different reasons, but still we did that, and it was a complete disaster, and most people wish we hadn't. My sense of it is that it wouldn't happen now, but maybe I'm being naive. I think Trump would have done something like that, but Trump is an idiot. In general, a person running this country would be unlikely to repeat an Iraq kind of experience today. Would you agree with that, or do you think that we would do it all over again, given a certain combination of factors?
I think it would be. I think it's a good observation that you make. I think it would be harder now because of the internet. Back in 2003, basically it was blanket coverage where everybody was saying the same thing. We rallied the entire public behind an invasion of a country that made absolutely no sense, had no connection whatsoever to 9/11, and yet we got most of the population behind it, and that was because there was such tremendous control over who spoke on the media, and that was most of what you saw. I remember Fair.org did an analysis talking about the guests on all the cable shows, both in right-wing and in MSNBC and CNN. And it was something like 200 and something generals versus one anti-war voice over the course of the 6 months preceding the invasion. But you wouldn't have that now. It's harder to have the sort of monomaniacal media thrust that we had back then. Obviously, Afghanistan, there was no problem convincing the public to go in after 9/11. I mean, there were pockets of people who were against the war, and there was a significant portion of the population that protested before the Iraq invasion. But we watched Biden's State of the Union address just recently, and one of the first things he stressed is we're not sending troops to that area. And obviously, it's a nuclear power on the other side, so there's a different vibe with this conflict. But I think you're right. I think it would be harder now to do than it was back then.
But I want you to address my Russiagate observation. John says Trump was an idiot. Let me stipulate that. Trump's an idiot. But the anti-Trump Russiagate motivated takedown attempts were built on sand. They were false. It was a moral panic. And I'm wondering whether or not it impeded our capacity to see what has now developed into a Russian attack in Ukraine, and whether or not possibilities of mitigating that by seeing Russia as a power that needed to be dealt with in a subtle way were missed through the fog of Russiagate, stealing our elections, Trump is a Putin puppet, et cetera. And please, take that up, Matt.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've obviously been pretty outspoken about this. I looked at it mostly from the media angle. I think Russiagate was an embarrassing episode in the history of American media mainly because of our propensity for reporting unsourced or stories that were sourced to anonymous intelligence sources where we can't see the proof of things. So, for instance, somebody might be told, well, the intelligence agents think that Carter Page is an agent of a foreign power, or the FISA court is reporting that this Trump aide has had secret meetings with Russian intelligence officials, but we can't tell you how we know that or why we know that. And as reporters, we're not supposed to just dump that out there on the front page. Like we're supposed to confirm that somehow. And there were years of stories where we didn't do that because I think there was a belief among some reporters that the story was true, and then there were other people who just were incautious, And yeah, I think you make a good observation that this cartoonized version of what Russia was and what they were capable of may have obscured our ability to analyze what was actually going on in the country. Certainly, in 2012, when Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney, and I think the quote was he called Russia a gnat on the butt of an elephant. That was. I think that was probably closer to the reality of what Russia was, where we depicted them as this all-powerful, sort of Iago-esque international figure that could reach into the American electoral system and change results. I don't think that was true at all. I think it's a nation that's got a lot of economic troubles, and the one thing that it has is a strong military, and it's deeply paranoid about the West, and it doesn't have a grand plan for conquering us. I think its plans are much more defensive. So on that front, like, they're deeply afraid of the West, which might have, I think, stimulated this invasion of Ukraine, if that makes sense. But I'm with you on Russiagate. Obviously I've got tens of thousands of words written about this, about that episode.
Matt, did you use the word Iago-esque?
Yeah,
you did.
I'm going to keep that. I like that.
You got to know your Shakespeare, but we do. We know our Shakespeare.
Well, of course.
You apologized for getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the apology from the mainstream media, quote unquote, for all the shit that they've gotten wrong over the last decade?
Yeah, well, non-existent. And if you go back even further to the WMD episode, not only did nobody apologize for getting that wrong, everybody got promoted. All the people who were the most wrong in that episode, they're all the editors of magazines now, some pretty influential ones, if you know what I'm talking about. And I don't think it's. I think the media, when they don't apologize for making mistakes, they just make a tactical error. Like, audiences, trust is the most important thing in media. If you don't have it, you're dead. You will lose audience share if people don't believe that you're being straight with them. If they don't believe that you have self-awareness, they won't listen to you anymore. And we've seen the national news media in this country has had tremendous problems keeping its audience, particularly with Trump out of the picture. And I think when you get stuff wrong, you got to cop to it, or else the people will stop believing what you have to say is true. And we just don't do that. Worse than that, we have a new habit of making silent edits. Right. So if there's a mistake, rather than announcing it in a big correction, you might just change it in the next version of the online, article, take out certain parts, not put a notation at the bottom of the page. Like, that stuff's also kind of Orwellian when you think about it, making changes and not telling people that there used to be another news story here that said something different. That's pretty creepy. And we're starting to do that more and more often.
A tiny bit of pushback on that, though.
Sure.
You're trying to
says the New York Times columnist,
where people's heads and hearts are, is that I think we tend, especially people who, I don't want to necessarily say intellectual, but people who have a story to tell, who are looking at things with a kind of broad perspective. You see trends, you get the feeling that things are moving in a certain direction, and your sense has to be, if you're any kind of scientist, your sense has to be that there are going to be some hairs out of place. There's going to be an eyelash behind the contact lens. Things go like this. They don't go like this. That's just the nature of things. And so you see something that's an exception. You see something that's wrong. And in your mind, you figure, okay, not perfect, but still the general story is this. I think you can therefore justify quite a bit. It can even go over 50%, quite a bit that doesn't fit your narrative. And I don't think that it's necessarily wrong to think in terms of narratives in itself. I think, frankly, to an extent, it's a kind of intelligence. If all you're going to do is collect butterflies, and Matt, I'm not accusing you of this at all, but if all you're going to do is collect butterflies, you're not an entomologist. And so, for example, we are talking around a few people in terms of these people who get promoted, et cetera, despite being wrong. I happened to have a conversation with one of those people not long ago for reasons that need not detain us. And that person was talking about, what's going on in Ukraine, et cetera. And I can say that that person has a story. That person is perfectly aware of what has gone wrong, where things have not followed the narrative of people like him. But I can't say that I found myself listening to a self-inflated blowhard who doesn't understand how the world works. It's that he sees a trend, and And I'm just going to leave it there. But, and Matt, I completely take your point.
John, excuse me for interrupting. You're being too subtle for me. Maybe you and Matt are following. And I'm not asking you to name a name. I'm just asking you to add a little bit more detail to what it is that you're trying to get across.
Well, these neocons, right, Matt? I mean, the people who 20 years ago had a certain story they were promoting about
those people.
Why Iraq made sense and America's place in the world. I know a lot of those people, and I continue to know a lot of those people in various ways. And I can say that I completely understand Matt's critique. I don't agree with those people anymore on these, world issues, but I can always see how they can sleep at night. And it's because a person has a narrative, and one has to have a narrative to engage the world intelligently to an extent, I think. Is that
okay? So I'm with you now, David Fromm. I'm with you now, Bill Crystal. I'm with you now, John Podhoretz. John Podhoretz Sucks is the title of one of Matt's recent columns. I'm with you now, Max Boot. Gelatinous mediocrity, and so forth and so on. You say they've got a story.
They do.
What do you say, Matt? What do you say?
Well, okay. No, I understand what John's saying, and I think there's even some validity to that. But no, I'm the son of a news reporter. I grew up in newsrooms around reporters, like not around politicians, not around people, ideologues, right? Like my father was not in the narrative business. The people that I grew up around, reporters as a group were people who, when they did a story on the night that the story was about to be published, they could not sleep because they were afraid they got some little fact in there wrong that was going to ruin their reputations. That was like a commonality for every person in the journalism business. So getting something huge wrong, like this idea that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction just around the corner. You trust us; it's right over that hill. And you do trust them, and you put it in the news, and it turns out not to be right. Like that's the kind of thing that you would not be able to live down if you were just purely a reporter, right? And I think I understand what you're saying, but there's a distinction, and this is what I was talking about. How there's been a drastic change in the way we do business. We are in the narrative business now. We didn't used to be. We were really much more in the business of saying, here's what we know, like we called all around, and this is what this person says, and this is what this person says, and this is what the official statements are. Here's the information. We checked it. You do what you want with it. You make your own decisions, and then we'll come back tomorrow and give you what we got since then. Now it's not really like that. Now we're in, what Wesley Loury calls the moral clarity business, which is we're trying to drive audiences in a direction. And I think we do that more than we used to, much more.
No, Wesley
Loury. He wrote an article about this whole phenomenon of what we call moral clarity in the journalism business, which is ditching the old objectivity model of journalism. What do you call the view from nowhere objectivity, which is just, the Republican says this, the Democrat says this, and here's the news, and do what you want with it.
By the way, I came to Boston in 1972 to go to graduate school and have lived here most of my life since. And I remember Mike Taibbi.
Oh, yeah.
I remember reading shoe leather reporting and, that kind of old school journalism in the newspaper here in Boston. Yeah. No, my dad was, he was very old school. Yeah. Old school reporter for sure. Yeah.
So you were at BU?
Well, I taught at BU 91 to 2005. I was in graduate school at MIT 72 to 76, and I taught at Harvard 82 to 91. So except for the 6 years between 76 and 82, I've been living in New England.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So fellow New Englander. That's terrific.
Yeah. Lived in Brookline. Used to take our kids to the Newton School of Music over there, and stuff like that, and read Mike Taibbi if I want to know what was going on.
Excellent. Excellent. Are you living in Providence now, or?
Yeah. I made the move down here. My late wife, Linda, she passed away 11 years ago. And thank you. I've since remarried. Oh, and by the way, my new wife, Lawan, is a big fan of Useful Idiots. And she said, is Katie going to be on? Is Katie going to be on? I said, no, not this time. just Matt.
Well, tell her I'm sorry.
Yeah, but, no, you needn't apologize. She appreciates you as well.
Excellent. Well, that's cool.
History it's always interesting to me to talk to the people who are responsible for these things, but there does come a point when you have to make a judgment and hold people accountable. And I hope I'm not implying that I don't believe that. I remember Rumsfeld on TV saying, well, it's only been 3 weeks. We're going to find them. Like you're saying that they're over the hill, and then they're never ever over any hill. And no one was held to account once. This is my name dropping day. I really don't do much but sit in my house. But I remember I was on some show where I was in a green room with Petraeus. And I asked him, because what else? The person next to me there was a Miss America, and I didn't have anything to say to her. And then on the other side of me was
green rooms are funny, man.
It was. So I just figured I'm going to talk to him. And I asked him very gently, how do you justify these terrible things that have happened? It's all gone wrong. You've got the Sunnis, out of power and angry. Like, this isn't the way it was supposed to go. And I wasn't accusatory, but I just said, how do you feel about this? And I don't think that this was a man in conflict. I think that he just was living life day to day and was always hoping that things would get better. But yeah, after a while, you have to make a judgment. I completely understand that. I have a hard time ever thinking of people as evil. And I don't think that's what you're saying, but I'm always interested in how people pull these things. Call me Hannah Arendt or something. But yeah, a judgment has to be made eventually.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, and I do draw a distinction between people who are making policy decisions and people who are reporting. I didn't agree with the idea that Rumsfeld's idea that we could, with one bold move, sort of build an Arab Switzerland and reform the Middle East that way. And I didn't agree with the benevolent hegemony concept that the Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan were pushing even before Bush got elected. This idea that we can't have countries that aren't sort of under our effective control out there. So we got to get rid of the rogue states, like North Korea and Iraq and Iran. But I think they honestly believe those things, and I think the Bush people probably did really think that we were going to be welcomed as liberators, and they thought it was going to work some other way. To me, that's crazy, but and this gets back to the idea about what happened in Russia is that I had a lot of experience knowing expats who lived abroad who made policy decisions, and a lot of the diplomats. And I was so unimpressed when I lived over there. So many of the people who were in positions of influence in the embassy were people who didn't speak Russian, had no sense of the country whatsoever, and really thought of what they were doing as a big game of Risk. And it wasn't real for them because they didn't have enough contact with the local population, which I think is what happened in the Middle East with the United States. We just expected that, Iraqis would behave as, like Americans, or that there wouldn't be any difference between Sunnis and Shiites and that sort of thing. And you can't be like that. You got to know, what the local populations are thinking. So,
Yeah. There was a language problem back then too. Not enough people spoke the languages.
That's for sure. Mm-hmm.
Pashto is impossible to learn. That's another thing. Not literally, but it's a really tough one. Yeah, I remember I wrote something about that at one point. Just you don't know the people. You can't talk to them. Yeah,
Matt, how did you come to know Russian?
So when I was much younger, I wanted to be a novelist. All my favorite writers were Russians.
They write the best novels. Yep.
They write great novels. I was a big fan of the really funny Russian writers like Nikolai Gogol. And so I wanted to learn Russian just so I could read those books in the native language. So I went there in 1989, 1990 at the end of the Soviet Union. I studied university there. And then when I graduated, I just started working as a stringer. We sort of went into the family business of journalism because I didn't have any other way to support myself. So I just learned, kind of on this, basically, on the street, just living there. But it's a beautiful language, Russian.
It's the Slavic languages are some of probably the 100 or 200 hardest languages in the world. They are tough. I mean, Pashto's hard, but Russian is harder. And yeah, it's gratifying when you crack it, but to speak it, you've got to live in it without a doubt. Yeah.
Okay, I know my Pasternak a little bit. I've read some Chekhov. I, of course, know my Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and whatnot. But in the last 50 years, if you were going to pick up a Russian novel, what would you recommend?
The last 50 years? Yeah. Well, I was a big fan of... let's see, Vladimir Vainovich.
I've never read a modern one. I never thought about that.
There's a great, he didn't write novels really. He wrote short stories. They were kind of like autobiographical fiction. There was a guy named Sergei Dovlatov, whose daughter lives in New York, actually, Katya Dovlatova. He's a brilliant writer. But he ended up in the United States. Let's see, of the Soviet writers, Zoshenko, but he was farther back.
What about post-Soviet? What about post-1991, kind of apocalyptic, things have fallen apart. Where are we now? What's the meaning of life?
Like Victor Pelevin is probably the big name.
Yeah.
I didn't, I was pretty old-fashioned. Even with American and English language novels, I tended towards always like 19th century, early 20th century books. I don't know. There must be some kind of character flaw, but yeah. So I'm not as well versed in the modern books.
Yeah. Well, our creative director Nikita Petrov, who works with the podcast and is a terrific guy, has been telling me about Pelevin, Victor Pelevin. He sent me a few of the books, actually, which I've been perusing. So
they're very funny. His books are funny.
Yeah, they're funny. And,
Okay. Once I was in a hotel room in Helsinki, and there was a Dovlatov novel on next to the TV for some reason. I guess somebody had left it.
In English?
No, it was in Russian. And I just left it because I didn't know who he was. So I should have looked at it, Matt. Huh?
Oh yeah, he's.
I remember that.
Hilarious, incredibly funny writer. If you're going to start with someone, start with a story called The Suitcase, which is really, really funny stuff. I mean, the Russians have a lot of incredibly funny writers. The story that actually got me into Russian literature was by a writer named Saltykov-Shchedrin, and he wrote a story called How a Mujik Fed Two Officials, and it's about how these two bureaucrats back in the Tsarist times, they wake up in a desert island and they're surrounded everywhere by food, fish, plants, but they don't know how to do anything for themselves, can't cook, and they end up like nearly starving to death until it suddenly occurs to them, what would we do at home? Oh, we'd call a servant.
Sure.
And so they go looking in the island for a servant. They find one sleeping. They call him lazy. They wake him up, and he goes and catches fish and cooks for them and everything. This is very funny stuff. They were really, really masters at satirical black humor, which I was really attracted to as a kid.
Okay, now here's the big question to a veteran of the MBA. And also a kid who grew up in Greater Boston. Celtics or Nets? Celtics or Nets?
The Celtics are great right now, but I'd be afraid to play them in the Nets in the playoffs. When they have both KD and Kyrie. They scare me. But I don't know. How do you go on that, Glenn?
I'm putting my money on the Celtics. I don't know if Ben Simmons is going to play again this season, and hopefully some of the playoff games will be in New York, so that Kyrie doesn't come on the court. This dude scored 60 points the other night, man.
I know. But I'm all about these seeds. I love the Time Lord's fantastic. I think he's amazing. So they got a great defense. Definitely.
John, got anything?
I know nothing. My ignorance of sports is awesome. I know nothing.
Nothing to be
I know that you
ashamed of.
say Celtics and not Celtics, but that's
It's all good, bro. It's all good. It's all good. And you seem to be proud of it, and no,
I'm not proud of it. It's depressing. It makes it hard to talk to guys sometimes because it's the lingua franca. I know nothing. It's embarrassing.
There's actually a great sports story that relates to that. So, Glenn, do you remember that time that Bo Jackson ran over Brian Bosworth? No? Okay. All right. Well, he was the great running back in the 80s.
I was going to ask what sport this was. Okay.
And he got asked after the game. Bo Jackson got asked about the play, and Bo said, "Brian Bosworth's got nothing to be ashamed of," which I thought was it was like the ultimately insulting quote. But John, you got nothing to be ashamed of.
You got nothing to be ashamed of, John.
I'll take it.
This has been the Glenn Show episode with John McWhorter and Matt Taibbi. Wonderful talk to you, Matt. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Glenn, John, thanks so much. Take care now.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay,
Bye.
take care.